Years ago, this author wrote a book called 24/7, Living It Up While Doubling It Down. And it basically was this book where he went to his publisher and he said, I want a $50,000 cash advance for me to take to Vegas and blow it all in Vegas. And I will not leave Vegas until I spend all $50,000. And that's what I'll write the book about. I'll write the book about life in Vegas, blowing all that money. And that's what he did. And right in the middle of this book, there's this fascinating story of how this guy, who's not right, this is not a religious book, I'm not recommending it, how he's at a strip club. And while he's at this strip club, he goes to the bathroom. And he says in the book, I never thought that the highlight of my time in Vegas would come in a topless bar's bathroom. But it was there that I met Joe, the bathroom attendant. And Joe was holding a Bible in a topless bar in Las Vegas. And everybody was looking at him like he was holding a handgun. They didn't know what to do with Joe. And eventually he asked, you're reading the Bible in a strip club in Vegas? And he said, yes, I'm a Christian. And he told him his story about how for years he had been on the streets of Vegas. He had been a drug addict. He had sold drugs. And eventually he was convicted for a decade in prison. And while he was in prison, the Lord found him. And a group of Christians changed his life around. And then when Joe got out of prison, he started getting connected to a local church. The grace that had turned him around also gave him a mission. And so Joe, the bathroom attendant, said, this is where God wants me. There's a lot of hurting people here. G.K. Chesterton once said that every man who walks into a brothel is looking for God. But that wasn't true of Joe. Joe was God's way of looking for them. And here's the point of this. Joe is not just a man in a strip club. He's a holy man in a strip club. He's a different kind of man in the strip club. And the biblical word for that is saint. So here's the thing about being holy. If you're a Christian, your definition of holiness is not staying away from the dirty, unclean people. That Jesus doesn't leave you that option. If you're a Christian, holiness means being different in the middle of unholy, unclean people. It means that if you're going to be in the bars, that you hold yourself to a standard of not consuming alcohol the way that other people do. It means that if you're going to be in these places, that you are different in those places, but you are in those places because that's what grace does. I hear the story of Joe, the bathroom attendant, and I think, only God's grace can do that. You remember the first time you discovered God's grace? Do you remember how life-changing that was? I hope we never forget that. About 2 weeks ago, I've never told this story. About 2 weeks ago, a phone call comes into the Highland Church of Christ. It's a woman who's very anxious about a particular situation, but not just that particular situation. She spent her whole life, being anxious, and this was just a situation that demanded it. Her brother was dying by that day. She didn't think he was going to live the rest of the day. And when he was a little boy, Highland had picked him up on a bus, and he had not had a religious background since then. But his mom was Church of Christ, and she had died about a decade earlier. And before she died, she looked at him and she said, "You better get into heaven," which is just, pretty high pressure stuff. And so he's dying. Cancer is knocking at the door. He's got moments to live, and she calls. And somehow it gets through to me. And so I grab my intern and we go out to Clyde where this guy lives. His kids have driven in from all across the state. And his sister is there and they're like, "Thank you so much." They're weeping. It's obviously a very emotional time. And they're like, "Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you came." He wants to be saved. So now I'm trying to figure out, how are we going to do this? How are we going to baptize this guy? He's got open wounds on him. What are we going to do to help this guy meet Jesus? And then his wife walks in, and she wasn't expecting us. Turns out that the sister called without telling her. And so they're like, "Oh, this is the preacher from Highland. He wants to. He's coming to help save Freddie." And the wife is like, "What? Is Freddie saved?" To which the kids and the sister are like, no, he's not. And so we're just kind of watching back and forth as we're figuring out whether Freddie is about to be in the arms of Jesus or not, right? And then she says, we've got our own pastor. We've got a Church of Christ pastor, which tells you something right there already, right? We've been going to church, and we don't need this new guy coming in. And the sister and the kids are whispering, she's lying. They don't go to church. And then when she walks out of the room, she whispers to the son, why don't you tell him that you called the preacher because she doesn't like me? And then the son's like, no. And so she looks at me and she's like, would you tell him that the son called because she doesn't like me? I was like, no, I'm not going to lie. And then I say, well, why don't you go talk to your dad and see what he would like to do? Which was a miscalculation on my part because it left me with the people who did not want me there for about 40 minutes. Yeah, right? They don't teach you this in college, right? How to deal with. And so I said, at one point, I want y'all to get that other preacher if that's at all possible, which, by the way, it was possible. But I think maybe the reason that I'm here is to help you say goodbye. Because it's obvious that you're very scared about your husband and your dad meeting God. And it reminds me of that story of the thief on the cross. You know that story? And it turns out they didn't. So I told him that story, and then I said, which is a lot like the story of the prodigal son. You know that story? And it turns out they didn't, which is why I suspect that they were so sad. And then I got to say this. Look, I don't know what image you have of God in your mind. I don't know what you're expecting, but I'll tell you this. In a little bit, when Freddie goes to meet God, I have a hunch he's going to enjoy it. I have a hunch that God will be smiling. And then all of a sudden, for the first time, some of them were too. Because this is at the heart of the universe. Do you know this? This is who God is. God actually loves us. And sometimes He wants to save us from ourselves. And by the way, he got baptized, so it's not no orthodoxy police or anything like that. But I want you to know, this is who Jesus was. This is who Jesus was trying to reveal God to be. He wanted us to know this is how good God actually is. But here's the part that bothers me so much. Did you know that they've discovered that the people who discover grace actually are the people who are the least motivated to serve God? Isn't that interesting? That once you discover the favor and the smile of God on your life, you actually begin to write off anything that you had before for motivation, for ways of serving God. For most of us, we don't think God is angry. We just think we can get by with not doing that much, which is interesting. But every now and then, I meet people. I meet people who are motivated to do things. Because there are people who are motivated to do things out of a deep anxiety about who God is and how God views them. And they find themselves becoming angrier and angrier and angrier. And then there are people who know God loves them and that Jesus is smiling, and so they don't have any kind of anxiety. And so they don't do much differently. But every now and then I meet somebody who does something different, who has committed their lives to making a difference for the kingdom of God. And they don't do it out of a place of deep anxiety. They do it out of a place of great joy because they're serving God and they know how good God is. And you know what the word for that is? Saint. I want so badly to be a saint. I want so badly for us to be saints. And this is what the gospel is trying to say to us. There are lots of good reasons to do the right thing and try to make the world a better place, but the greatest of all is love. So there's this one time where Jesus is talking to the religious leaders of His day, and they're upset with Him because He's hanging out with the tax collectors and the sinners. And so Jesus tells them the story that I told Freddie and his family about the prodigal son, about the father who has two sons, and one of them goes off. He asks for his inheritance. And he takes the money from his dad. And the only thing more scandalous that he would ask for that, basically saying you can't be dead soon enough, is that the dad would give it to him. So he goes off and he blows it on what young men blow their money on. And eventually he hits rock bottom, and he's so tired of eating what the pigs eat, he decides to eat humble pie. And he turns around and he starts going home, and the whole way home he's making an apology speech. Because when you've blown it this much, you better have a good apology. And he's saying, Father, I'm going to say, I've sinned against heaven and against you, which is actually from the book of Exodus, which is what the Pharaoh had said. So he's quoting Exodus. And he's saying, make me a servant, make me a slave. And the father, who while he's a long way off, still sees him, which means he never stopped looking, runs out there, doesn't even let him finish his apology, kills a fatted calf, puts the ring on him, covers his shame, and throws a party. And this party's so great that there's music and you can hear the dancing because they had just passed a policy that allowed you to dance at the school. Anyway. And then the father, who's always looking out for his sons, notices that another son has gone prodigal on him. And he goes out to the son with his crossed arms. And the son says, all these years I've been what? Slaving. And Luke fades the gospel to black there. You don't know what happens next. He doesn't tell you what happens next. All you know is that this brother is so angry. He's using a word for slavery, which is the religious leaders of the day would immediately picked up on because that's Exodus language. And basically, Jesus is saying, don't be the wrong characters in your own story. Because the father isn't Pharaoh. But it doesn't matter who the father is. If you think God is like Pharaoh, then you will spend your years slaving. You will think that you are working for something that had always been yours. Americans work harder than anybody else in the world. We work constantly. We can't take breaks. And a lot of us work trying to avoid the very life that God has given us. We work long hours at the office trying to avoid the hard work of being a spouse or being a parent or being a friend. A lot of us use work as a way to slave away from the very things that can save our soul. And the invitation of the gospel is that we work not for God, but with Him. I mean, you catch that in the prodigal son story. All this time, everything I had was yours. It was like you were doing this with me, not for, but the way the older brother saw it. And that is the question, isn't it? What is God like? Who am I working for? And then Luke ends it. We don't know the way it plays out unless you start looking at the book of Acts. Because the book of Acts, the sequel, the Empire Strikes Back to the Gospel of Luke, we meet another older brother, a Pharisee, a guy who'd spent his life being the slave, slaving away for God. And all of a sudden, Jesus, the father in the story, comes out on the way to Damascus, Saul. He is going to set things right. He's not going to let those loosey-goosey Christians get by with anything. He's going to go set things right. And the Father, Jesus, comes out to him, reveals himself, and everything turns upside down for the older brother. And suddenly the older brother starts going all over the world, planning these little churches, saying, no, God is actually like this. God isn't the way we thought He was. He's actually like this. He goes all over, and one of those places who Josh Ross is going to talk about next is this letter to this community in Ephesus. And at one point he tells this community in Ephesus, he says, you know what God's like? It's by grace we've been saved through faith. And then he talks about our works. But you know what the word for works there is? It's the Greek word poema. Let me hear you say poema. Poema. It's where we get the word poetry. And that is the question, isn't it? When we work for God, do we do it as slavery? Or is it poetry? Do we work out of the blessing of God? Or are we trying to work for the blessing of God? Because it's possible to live your life doing the right things for the wrong reasons. It's possible to serve the wrong God only to be disappointed by how really good the actual God is. And this is the point of the gospel. Out of the deep love and favor, the smile of God, can you live differently? Not to earn it, but because that's the deepest reality in the universe. Can you partner in that with Him in great joy? My favorite hymn, almost of all time, is O Holy Night. I love the song. I love the way it knows what it's doing. It says, fall on your knees, which is not a request. I mean, it's a demand in the light of the gospel, like you could do anything but fall on your knees. And then it goes on to say like what Jesus has done basically. Because of the incarnation, the soul has felt its worth. Chains shall he break because the slave is our brother. Because this is what Jesus has done. No matter who you are, Christian or non-Christian, what you think of when you think of human rights, of justice, of mercy, you think of that because of Jesus. Because Jesus, God in the flesh, came alongside people, stood among the least of these, and said their life matters, and the soul has felt its worth. And people for thousands of years, saints for thousands of years, have worked to say, this is what God is like. So we're going to make that a reality. We're going to make the smile of God visible to as many people as possible. So the church that Brandon and I work at, a couple months ago, Martha wanted to throw a party. Martha had gotten out of prison. She'd been in prison for about 10 years. And she wanted to throw a party because her parole was over and she could finally travel and see different places in the world. And so thank God we decided that was worth a bit of cake and punch. We had like balloons and there were high fives and hugs. And it was just, we were celebrating the things that need to be celebrated more. But Martha's story started a long time before that party. Because when she was first in prison, she told me this just a few weeks ago and it broke me. She told me when she was first in prison, everybody else was getting letters from their family. Everybody else was, was loved and at least they weren't lonely. And so she was complaining one day and a chaplain overheard her. And the chaplain said, you know what you should do? You should read the New Testament because Paul wrote letters in there. You should read those kind of letters from that guy who used to be an angry older brother. And just consider those letters from your family. And Martha, who's not, one for sentimentality, thought that was a dumb idea. And so she got the Bible, actually threw it across a cell. But sometime later, she picked it up. And she read one book. Actually, she read one word of one verse that made her go on to read the whole New Testament, which made her go on to become a Christian. And the one word was Ephesians 1:1. It was where Paul said, I, Paul, a prisoner. And the soul feels its worth. That's what God's love can do. That's what saints can do. Let's stand and worship.